Hey everyone, Cody Hayes here, and I'd like to welcome you to part two as we look at events that helped shape the New Testament. And so we left off with the end of what's known as the Babylonian captivity of the Jews, where the Jewish people are liberated by the Persians, led by Cyrus the Great, and they're allowed to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple. And the religion of the Persians at the time was Zoroastrianism, and so a lot of the ideas, the beliefs of the Zoroastrians during the dialogue between, the Persians and the Jewish people, a lot of those ideas, started to make their way into Judaism. And, two of them were how the Zoroastrians had the notion of the sons of light versus the sons of darkness. So the sons of light would, of course, be led by God, and the other sons would be essentially the angels, the members of God's court, where then the sons of darkness are these fallen angels who are led by the Satan, who is kind of the chief antagonizer, you could say. And also, they had a concept of fire as a form of punishment, but also as a form of purification. So, on the punishment side, you have hell, and then on the purification side, cleaning out the impurities, you have purgatory. These concepts, would remain within Christianity, and some of them would later enter Islam, but they would eventually be rejected by the Jewish people, particularly the idea of Satan, the concept of Satan. Um, the Jewish people don't have a set view on the afterlife. I mean, of course, they do have a view that, you have God in the heavens, in heaven, but they don't, necessarily hold that people go there upon death. Um, some Jewish people might have a concept of hell that would be kind of more like, I guess you could say, purgatory, in that, in the sense at least that it's not a forever type of punishment, but not all Jewish people would hold to that. In terms of concepts of demons, I mean, Jewish people do have notions of, evil spirits, but, they hold that God would be responsible for all of this. Like, to give an example, when Saul loses divine favor, God sends this wicked spirit to harass Saul. And then when David plays his harp, God sends the wicked spirit away, but God is in control of everything. And the Jewish people also do have an idea of, say, exorcisms. You can see this in the book of Tobit and the Deuterocanonicals, what a lot of Protestants will refer to as the Apocrypha. But the big thing that the Jewish people rejected, is the idea of the Satan figure that you would see carry on later into Christianity and into Islam. From the Jewish perspective, the idea of the Satan figure was almost viewed as a type of another god, and thus a violation of monotheism. So when the Jewish people do make references to Satan, Satan is really understood as nothing more than a figure of speech. Um, the Satan figure is, I mean, the word refers to accuser, so it's kind of like the tempter in a way, but not, but it's not understood as having, any type of metaphysical realm of his own. Like in the book of Job, the Satan figure is a part of God's heavenly court. And when God talks about how, my servant Job, look how much he loves me, and the Satan figure is like, yeah, he loves you because you give him everything. What if you took it all away from him? Would he love you then? And God's like, well, that's a very good question. That kind of thing. So, the big thing that the Jewish people eventually rejected is the idea of Satan that you would find within Christianity and Islam. It is also during the period of the Babylonian captivity, or sometime afterwards, that many historians argue that the Torah, the law, as we would conceive of it, was formed. So the Torah, the law, the books of Genesis through Deuteronomy, which for the Jewish people is the most important part of their scriptures. The other parts of their scriptures, like the historical slash prophetic prophetic books, and then, the writings, yeah, they're important, but they don't carry the same amount of weight as the Torah, the law does. And the Torah, it consists of 613 commandments. The 10 commandments are just but 10 of the 613. Modern day Jews cannot practice all of those 613 commandments because a lot of them related to the temple system, the temple cult, and there is no longer a temple. But to say some things more about the Torah traditionally it's said to have been written by Moses. However, and I think to a certain degree this was kind of always known, but beginning in the Middle Ages, historians, both Jewish and Christian, began to question the Mosaic authorship. Um, One of the best examples that I think of this, and this comes from when I took a course over the Hebrew Bible, or what Christians would call the Old Testament, how at the end of Deuteronomy, the author describes the death of Moses. And I remember the professor that I had read from that portion of Deuteronomy and looked at us and said, "So, did Moses write his own obituary?" And it's something that always stood out to me. And I remember going and asking our former department head of religious studies at Missouri State, Dr. Moyer, whose expertise was the Hebrew Bible, what Christians would call the Old Testament. And I remember he was getting ready to go to a meeting, so he couldn't really talk to me. And I said, "Well, I was just curious to know, how someone with a more conservative stance would argue that Moses wrote the Torah when Deuteronomy describes the death of Moses." And he's like, "Okay, well, I can answer that for you pretty quickly." They would say that it's not literally Mosaic, but that it's Mosaic like. And then there were those who would argue that Moses did, in fact, write his own obituary. And then there are those who would say that I don't have a clue as to what I'm talking about. Well, if you perhaps, if there was only just that one passage in Deuteronomy, then you could make the case, okay, Moses, yeah, he wrote all of the Torah, but not this last bit. Well, then, when you look at other portions of the Torah, you start to see some other issues. Like, for example, in the book of Numbers, it talks about how Moses was the most humblest of men. Well, would a humble man actually write that about himself? And then in Genesis, it talks about how there was a king in Israel. Well, the problem there is that the monarchy in Israel wasn't established until at least about 200 years or so after the death of Moses. So, arguably, perhaps to take a moderate stance, some of the Torah probably does go back to Moses, but certainly not in the final form that we have it as. And in the 19th century, Julius Wellhausen, who was a German historian, he argued for what was known as the documentary hypothesis to explain the Torah. But regardless of which, the Torah, as we would conceive of it, the books of Moses being, written during the Babylonian captivity of the Jews, or certainly sometime right after that, one of the reasons why historians argue around this time period is because when the Jewish people are allowed to return to their homeland and rebuild their temple, and I believe this is in Isaiah, It could be in Ezra. I'm not entirely sure, but it talks about how the books of Moses, are brought out. So obviously you had some form of it, in that time period. And also, just to add one more point before moving on, this is also the period where a lot of historians argue that you would see the beginnings of the Samaritans. That the Samaritans were essentially Jewish people, and you had an internal dispute, and so the group of people that we would call the Samaritans went in a different direction. And the Samaritans, they have their own version of the Torah, which is very similar to the Hebrew or the Jewish. The one big difference is the emphasis within the Samaritan Torah that God must be worshipped on Mount Gerizim. So, moving forward here, Israel, Judea, would eventually find itself under Greek control during the reign of Alexander the Great, and this Greek control would last until the year 163 BCE/BC. And let me have a quick sip of water here before I discuss more on this point. The image that I have on the screen is of Aristotle tutoring his famous student Alexander the Fourth, who has gone down in history as Alexander the Great. So Alexander the Great is conquering the known world, and he conquers Israel, Judea, and then upon his death in Babylon, his empire is divided up among his generals. And so Israel, Judea, came under the control of what is known as the Seleucid Empire, what was known as the Seleucid Empire. And this would last until 163 BC. What happened to cause its fall was that the Greeks didn't really properly maintain a parasitic relationship with those whom they had control over. Because why I say that is, a parasitic relationship, it's not in the interest of the parasite to kill the host. So what you do is essentially you let the people that you have control over essentially live their lives the same way, but you take, from them, what you would need, tax money or, valuables or whatnot, but something that would go to you. But other than that, let them live their lives as they normally would, leave them alone. Well, that's not what the Greeks decided to do. Essentially, they thought that it would be a great idea to put a statue, an image of their main god Zeus in the temple in Jerusalem. And this infuriated the Jewish people, and led by Judas the Maccabean and his brothers, Judas Maccabeus and his brothers, they essentially kicked out the Greeks and re-cleansed the temple. And this event is celebrated with the Jewish festival that is known as Hanukkah. Well, during this period of Greek rule, Jews began to disperse around the Greco-Roman world. This is really the beginnings of what we would call the Jewish diaspora, where the Jewish people are not living in their native land. They're living in Greco Roman cities such as Alexandria or Corinth or Carthage or Rome, Athens. So they're living in cities all over the Greco Roman world. Well, we're going to need to stop here, but when we come back, we will see a major text that was produced during this time period regarding the Jewish people. So take care. I will symbolically see you then.